yine de böyle biraz ton yüksek olduğunu istedim.
Ne zaman başlayalım?
Bir dakikaya başlıyoruz.
Tamam. Görüntü vermeye başlayalım.
Başladık yani.
Tamam. Başlayalım. Bir dakika daha bekleyin. Başlayalım. Tamam. Welcome to our side event on the margins of the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly. We are delighted to be convening today to discuss the title of our event, The United Nations, the People, and the Imperative Justice in Palestine, a conversation with the Gaza People's Tribunal. So we've convened to discuss the Gaza People's Tribunal and introduce it to the extent possible to those who are attending the General Assembly and its side events. My name is Aslı Bali. I'm a professor of law. I specialize in international human rights law, international humanitarian law, the laws of war, the law of the international security order, and comparative law of the Middle East. I currently also serve as the president of the Middle East Studies Association of North America, and I am delighted to be here as one of the many individuals that you will be hearing from today who are associated with the Gaza People's Tribunal. I'm going to begin with just some very, very brief introductions. I encourage you to take a look at the website of the Gaza People's Tribunal. Apart from myself, almost everyone else who is speaking today is a member of the steering committee, and therefore you can read their longer bios on the website of the Gaza People's Tribunal. But let me just begin with some introductions. First, immediately to my left is Taha Ayhan, who is a lawyer, scholar, and activist, and president of the Islamic Youth Cooperation Forum, to whom we are extremely grateful for sponsoring this discussion. And then I'm going to introduce those who are on the screen behind me in the order in which they will be speaking. First, Richard Falk is a professor of international law and international relations, a scholar, a public intellectual, and a former United Nations Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Palestine. He also today serves as the president of the Gaza Tribunal. After Richard, we will hear from Penny Green, who is also a professor of law. She's a researcher, writer, scholar across a range of international law topics and a member of the steering committee of the Gaza Tribunal. After Penny, we will hear from Craig McIver, who is an international human rights lawyer, writer, and activist, and served as a former senior United Nations official. And he too is a member of the steering committee of the Gaza Tribunal. So once more, I direct your attention to the website of the Gaza Tribunal to read the much more extensive bios that we have up for all of our presenters. Michael Link, who will follow after Craig McIver, is professor of law and himself also a scholar and former United Nations Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in the occupied Palestinian territories and a member of the steering committee of the Gaza Tribunal. Then we will turn next to the other member of the tribunal who is here with us in person, Wissam Ahmed, who is a prominent Palestinian human rights advocate, activist, organizer, and researcher, and also serves on the steering committee of the Gaza Tribunal. And finally, last but not least, we will hear from Professor Wadia Saeed, who is also joining us by Zoom and is a Palestinian-American professor of law, again, a prominent writer and scholar on the subject of international law, as well as domestic laws of terrorism and counterterrorism in the United States, and a member of the steering committee of the Gaza Tribunal. I'm just going to begin with a few comments about the importance of the work that we will then be sharing with you through the remaining panelists. International law has, as anybody who's in this audience would know, served as an enduring reference point for Palestine, as well as an enduring source of frustration. In applying international law doctrine to Palestine, international lawyers and legal institutions have had to reckon with the gaps, ambiguities, and contradictions inherent in the law. Unexpected historical conjunctures have sometimes provided opportunities and more often resulted in defeats for legal actors seeking to advance key arguments and secure basic victories for the self-determination and human rights of the Palestinian people. These struggles have underscored the asymmetries of power and structural biases that are baked into international law and its institutions. Those seeking alternative jurisprudential paradigms to the reigning canon of international law that privileges states in the international system, powerful states even more so, and denies meaningful rights and the capacity for self-determination for stateless peoples like the Palestinian people. So those seeking alternatives to these jurisprudential paradigms have long sought sources of international law beyond the received canon, producing innovative doctrinal frameworks that might better address contemporary challenges and expand international law's toolkits. At this moment, we are living through a genocide that itself has provoked the traditional institutions of international law, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, the United Nations General Assembly, the United Nations Human Rights Council, amongst others, to be mobilized to some extent in response to the atrocities that are being committed by Israel in Gaza. And each of these conventional international legal responses has been surprising in its own way, because these are also actors that have long been silent, or at least paralyzed, in the face of the long durée of slow motion ethnic cleansing and suffering that has been unfolding for over 3/4 of a century in Israel-Palestine. But they've been mobilized as a consequence of the genocide, and yet they remain constrained by the conventional international legal responses available to them, limited as a consequence of the internal logic of their institutional structures, whether those relate to jurisdictional limitations, legal standing doctrines, procedural constraints, or the restricted authorities and competences delegated to them by member states, or simply the inability to marshal the necessary political will to meet the basic obligations of law, morality, humanity, and solidarity in the face of genocide. I did not include pointedly the United Nations Security Council on the list of institutions that I began with, because it is essentially disabled by design from serving as a meaningful avenue to respond to a genocide, being committed with the unequivocal support of one of its permanent members. What is left then, in a circumstance where all of the other institutions are engaged and yet unable to deliver actual outcomes, let alone an end to the suffering that we are witnessing and the atrocity crimes that are being committed? What is left then of the demands for justice, accountability, and transnational solidarity? How might alternative jurisprudential paradigms facilitate adjudication of the Gaza genocide and produce the transnational civil society mobilization needed to produce the political will to intervene in and disrupt genocide? Rather than replicating the formal legal procedures of the institutions I just named, the Gaza Tribunal tries to address the major limitations of those institutions. It operates on what I'm going to describe as an achievable timetable, documenting ongoing atrocities in real time, rather than waiting to adjudicate historical crimes after genocide has been completed. It provides a forum for affected individuals and civil society organizations whose testimonies are restricted in formal proceedings. And most significantly, it presents genocide as a comprehensive assault on Palestinian life and futurity, by which I mean the possibility even of a future for Palestinian communities, by examining systemic harms in one forum, not piecing apart the substantive, distinct portions of the harms across multiple forums, and by examining ecocide, famine, destruction of educational infrastructure, genocidal extermination, ethnic cleansing, destruction of cultural heritage, all of the different dimensions of the current ongoing violence, not only in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, in the Israeli territories and beyond. I speak there of the violence. The tribunal's focus is Gaza. Crucially, the tribunal's comprehensive documentation translates legal findings into tools for political action. By creating a multimedia archive accessible to lawyers, academic researchers, policymakers, and media workers, it equips diverse actors to pursue accountability through multiple channels. Recognizing that meaningful change requires organized political pressure, the very pressure whose absence explains the lethargy of existing institutions, the tribunal explicitly aims to support solidarity initiatives, most notably BDS, that is to say, boycott, divestment, sanctions, the call of Palestinian civil society to cut Israel off and its institutions and those who support those institutions meaningfully from global integration, but also incorporating the work of religiously motivated groups, organized labor, and advocates of compliance with international law more broadly. This bridging role reflects a sophisticated understanding of how legal change occurs, not through law alone, but through the interaction of normative frameworks and political mobilization. When governments refuse to implement international law, and the UN is therefore incapable of doing so because it is the instrument of the member states, people's tribunals allow direct access to civil society mobilization and model the ways in which civil society can generate pressure for enforcement through documentation, consciousness raising, and coalition building. Legal victories without political mobilization cannot shape facts on the ground. In pursuing multiple functions simultaneously, the Gaza Tribunal embodies alternative jurisprudential paradigms, not as utopian replacements for international law, but as a practical demonstration of the potential of international law when wielded in the hands of global civil society. By centering marginalized voices and integrating multiple knowledge systems, the tribunal demonstrates what international law might look like if reconstructed through solidarity rather than sovereignty, through pluralism rather than Western universalism. In the words, and I'm going to close with this, of the Sarajevo Declaration of the Gaza Tribunal, which met in Sarajevo in May and issued this declaration, quote, "The events of the past 2 years have convinced us that both key international organizations and most countries of the world, whether acting individually or collectively, have failed in defending the human rights of the Palestinian people and in responding to Israel's genocide in Palestine. We are convinced that the challenge of justice now falls to people of conscience everywhere, to civil society and to social movements, that is, to all of us. Palestinian lives and indeed Palestinian futures are at stake. The international moral and legal order is at stake. We must not fail. We will not relent." Our panel today will address how the Gaza Tribunal is rising to meet this challenge as articulated at Sarajevo. And with that, I am delighted to before we turn to our substantive presentations on the tribunal, to invite Taha Ayhan, who, again, as I've mentioned, is president of the Islamic Cooperation Youth Forum, an affiliated institution to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and an organizational sponsor of our tribunal and of today's panel, to address us with a few words of his own. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Aslı Hocam. Dear Excellencies, dear professors, dear esteemed participants, dear ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming to our event, first of all, both in person and also the online audience. On behalf of the Islamic Cooperation Forum, it's my honor to welcome you all to this important side event here at the United Nations General Assembly. We gather today with heavy hearts, but also with an unyielding sense of responsibility, because Gaza is not only a humanitarian crisis, it's a test of our common humanity, of the credibility of international law. Since October 8th, the suffering of Palestinian people has reached new depths. What we are witnessing is not only simply another episode of conflict, but an unfolding genocide in which civilians, women, children, the elderly, are deliberately deprived of food, medicine, and security. Entire neighborhoods, even the entire city, have been leveled, cultural and educational institutions destroyed, and generations traumatized. The shocking numbers of deaths and injuries do not fully capture the pain, because behind every statistic, there's a human story of loss, dignity denied, and futures stolen. For ICYF, the Palestinian cause and the tragedy of Gaza in particular has always been central. As an institution representing youth across the OIC world and beyond, ICYF believes that young people have a unique role to play in mobilizing conscience and solidarity. We are proud to support the Gaza Tribunal as one of its sponsors, and we see this initiative as an example of how civil society can rise to the challenge when governments and institutions fall short. And I want to express my heartfelt thanks, starting from the Professor Falk, who is the chairman of the initiative, but also for all members and all the participants of the Gaza Tribunal, because it has been realized by efforts of many people, and especially in such a difficult times, it's very obvious for me to how hard to be part of this Gaza Tribunal initiative. Indeed, one of the most disturbing dimensions of this crisis has been the failure of international institutions to uphold their mandates. The United Nations was established to prevent atrocities such as genocide, yet in Gaza, we see the paralysis of the Security Council, the inability of powerful states to rise above political interests, and the shocking silence of many governments. And we are witnessing the spillover effect of untamed violence. Watching states normalize the mass killing and collective punishment of a besieged population should trouble every defender of human dignity. But, dear colleagues, despite these failures, we must not surrender to despair. Across the world, people's movements have been rising. From university campuses to parliaments, from churches and mosques to city squares, ordinary people are demanding justice for Palestine, even it's getting more and more difficult every day. It's precisely in this space that initiatives like the Gaza Tribunal find their moral authority. The Gaza Tribunal was founded to bear witness, to document, and to mobilize, and especially, as it's underlined by Dr. Aslı, the Gaza Tribunal's uniqueness is about the future readiness. Its first public session held in Sarajevo this past May resulted in the Sarajevo Declaration, which powerfully condemned Israel's genocidal policies, settled colonialism and apartheid, and called upon governments and civil society to end this scandal of inaction. Sarajevo was not chosen by accident. It was chosen because it symbolizes both horrors of war and resilience of human dignity of modern times. In August, the tribunal also issued an emergency statement at the United Nations urging member states to activate the Uniting for Peace resolution and to take immediate measures to halt genocide. We reminded the international community that the responsibility to protect is not a rhetorical commitment, but a binding obligation. If ever there was a moment for these principles to be invoked, it's now. And yet, everyday inaction costs more innocent Palestinian lives. And the time that has been passed since the August of the declaration, unfortunately, the time has proved that how the declaration was right. The new genocide and the new violence has been unfolded since the August. Today, as we meet here, the people of Gaza remain under siege, and yet they also remain steadfast. Their resilience calls us to action. As ICYF, we affirm that our support will not waver. We will continue to amplify their voices, mobilize youth networks, and work with partners across the globe to demand justice and accountability. Looking ahead, the Gaza Tribunal will convene its final session in Istanbul from October 23 to October 26, 2025. At this historic gathering, experts, witnesses, and jurors of conscience will deliver the tribunal's final findings and recommendations. We believe this will not only establish a permanent archive of truth, but will also energize global solidarity for Palestine at a critical juncture. So you're always welcome to Gaza Tribunal final session, and also you can be the jury, global jury of the Gaza Tribunal by Witness Eye channel or through the other social media accounts. Dear participants, the genocide in Gaza is the greatest moral challenge of our time. Future generations will ask whether we stood by in silence or whether we acted with courage. The answer must be clear. We cannot change the past 19 months of our horror, but together we can influence what comes next. Let us therefore recommit here in the halls of the United Nations to do everything in our power to stop the killing, to hold perpetrators accountable, and to build a future where Palestinians, like all people, live in freedom, safety, and dignity. Thank you very much, all once again, and hope it will be a good session. Thank you very much.
Great. And now I would like to invite Professor Richard Falk to begin the substantive presentations about the work of the tribunal. Richard, the floor is yours. And I'll be keeping all of our presenters to time, so you have 15 minutes.
Driven outcomes to human wrongdoing that are not being addressed by national governments or international institutions. These tribunals offer the people of societies an opportunity to express objections to the most notorious international crimes and to encourage solidarity with the suffering and abuse of victims, including the animal inhabitants of nature. Above all, a people's tribunal seeks to draw attention to enforcement, accountability, and complicity gaps in situations that challenge deeply the moral conscience of humanity. Recourse to a people's tribunal of this character was first established in the middle of the Vietnam War by two world-famous intellectuals, Bertrand Russell and Jean-Paul Sartre. Its procedures and findings were dismissed at the time by governments and media as lacking the force of law that could only be established by recourse to national and international courts. Unlike standard judicial procedures, people's tribunals perform as partisan undertakings that do not pretend to be neutral and do not offer a fair process for the presentation of defensive arguments by the alleged perpetrator of international crimes, as would be the case in any proceeding before the ICJ or ICC. The Russell Tribunal and every subsequent People's Tribunal that has been established in the intervening 50 years has not purported to judge the guilt or innocence of the parties, but to legitimate opposition, to clarify the nature of criminality, and to encourage activism. The central goal is to promote as objectively as possible the exposure of abusive behavior by the accused state and setting forth action initiatives and policy recommendations directed at civil society, as well as indirectly directed at national governments and international institutions. Such civil society tribunals also encourage accountability for the main perpetrators and complicit actors, making a maximum effort to connect the crime to the alleged criminals. The best of these tribunals also develop a permanent archive that would offer objective interpretations of evidence, including survivor and expert witnessing. This kind of archive has the potentiality to contribute to future citizen education about the events, free from the manipulations of state propaganda. The model of the Russell Tribunal inspired many subsequent efforts along similar lines, although each instance needs to be sensitive to the distinctive circumstance of a particular case. The Gaza Tribunal was formed against this background with a particular sensitivity to the urgency of reacting to genocide, the crime of crimes. The context in which Israel's policy toward the attack on October 7th unfolded, especially in its first 18 months, enjoyed the geopolitical shielding and backing of most of the world's leading liberal democracies situated in Europe and North America. Israel also benefited from a self-censoring mainstream media that long refused to allow the daily spectacle of atrocities and accompanying dehumanizing language used by Israeli leaders to be objectively reported, and to this day are very cautious about endorsing any pro-Palestinian populist initiatives. There was little governmental and institutional opposition to Israel's behavior until South Africa made its historic submission to the ICJ in late 2023, dramatically charging that Israel was acting in Gaza in violation of the Genocide Convention of 1948. The Gaza Tribunal, formed more than a year ago in response to months of failure by the UN and other political actors to expose and end the ongoing Palestinian ordeal in Gaza. This ordeal resulted from Israel and its supporters' defiant disregard of international law and the majority views of the governments and peoples in the world. A defining instance of this defiance was the refusal to comply with the interim rulings of the ICJ in 2024 that went so far as to attach the word plausible to allegations of genocide and to order Israel to stop interfering with the international delivery of humanitarian aid. One problem with waiting for the ICJ's final judgment is that it's not expected for at least another year, and that seems too long to provide any meaningful relief to the Palestinians in Gaza. Our Gaza Tribunal plans its final session in Istanbul between October 23rd and 26th, including a judgment on the question of genocide and issues of accountability and complicity. But if Israel pays no attention to the ICJ or ICC, what makes anyone other than an idealistic fool think that it would pay attention to the findings and recommendations of the Gaza Tribunal? Such a cynical question misses the point, purpose, and goals of a people's tribunal. It takes for granted the refusal of Israel to give any attention whatsoever to the tribunal to avoid giving its actions credibility. Besides, Israel's counter-arguments would be so weak if they stuck to the substance that they would more likely resort to accusations that the Gaza Tribunal is itself unlawful and biased, if not anti-Semitic. The primary audience for the Gaza Tribunal is civil society, including the responsible voices of the media. Its short-term goal is to legitimate allegations of genocide, a task made easier in recent months by the compelling reports of the UN Special Rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, and the report released just a few days ago by the UN Commission of Inquiry on Gaza that confirmed in great detail that Israel's conduct in Gaza violated the Genocide Convention in numerous respects. With such backing, an expected verdict along similar lines by our tribunal's jury of conscience will add to the growing consensus that Israel has become a pariah or rogue state and needs the pressure of sanctions and boycotts to coerce or exact punitive costs if there is ever to be a chance of curtailing its present patterns of criminality and denial of Palestinian rights. In conclusion, we appeal to all persons of global conscience to join us in this effort of the Gaza Tribunal to bring punitive justice to Israel and offer overdue restorative justice to the Palestinian people. We must not be silent or sit on our hands while the Palestinian tragedy is allowed to go on, or even after the violence stops. Here at the site of the UN, it is time for bold and courageous action, legally possible by creative and committed invocations of the Uniting for Peace procedures and responsibility to protect norm. The Gaza Tribunal would welcome and ardently support such moves as initiatives that uphold the mission undertaken by the UN 80 years ago and rekindle its promises to humanity with respect to peace, human rights, and equitable development. Thank you.
Dr. Willie Mutunga, who is the former Chief Justice President of the Supreme Court of Kenya, and who has agreed, to our great delight, to serve as one of the members of the jury of conscience of the Gaza Tribunal. So Dr. Mutunga, welcome. We're so delighted to have you among us. Thank you for being here. And with that, I'm going to resume our program and turn the floor now to Professor Penny Green. Penny, please. The floor is yours and you have 15 minutes.
Dangerous precipice. Palestine has exposed the fissures and fractures that so glaringly divide our capitalist world. It has revealed in raw brutality the gaping chasm between persecutors and the persecuted, oppressors and the oppressed, colonizers and the colonized, the rich and the poor, the governors and the governed. And in doing so, Palestine has become the vanguard for the global anti-fascist, anti-colonial movement, for an awakening and recognition that change must come from below, must come from a newly animated civil society. The Gaza Tribunal encapsulates a key effort in this enterprise. My initial remarks relate to civil society law and challenging state crime through initiatives such as the Gaza Tribunal, the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Movement, the Global Sumud Flotilla, and the Sarajevo Declaration, which will follow. Deploying law strategically, as we've heard, and as the wonderful Hind Rajab Foundation do in their pursuit of holidaying Israeli genocidaire, and South Africa's incredibly powerful case against Israel at the ICJ, can play a very powerful role in the civil resistance against genocide. But imagining that the international legal order, through the international courts, can play anything more than a symbolic and normative role in the struggle is deeply misguided. With respect to Palestine, Israel has breached over 30 UN Security Council resolutions without consequence, and its daily egregious international crimes have led to nothing but impunity. Israel's ongoing genocide reflects the abject failure of the UN system thus far to prevent and punish war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Indeed, yesterday the US shamefully vetoed a call for a ceasefire for the 6th time at the UN Security Council. For me, as a scholar of state crime, the solutions to state crime lie well outside the frameworks of criminal justice, law, international conventions, and international courts. Instead, any such real solutions are much more likely to be found in the struggles of the state's victims or with those who advocate and organize as allies of those victims. And it's the organization of those victims and allies that not only has the power to challenge state violence, but it is actually central in defining that violence as criminal in the first instance. Civil society has proven itself to be a much more effective force than international law in identifying, gathering, and analysing evidence and naming and challenging the devastating crimes of states, particularly through campaigns of civil disobedience, mass strikes, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and as with the Global Sumud Flotilla, maritime attempts to break Israel's illegal blockade of Gaza. Civil society enjoys widespread legitimacy as an authoritative check on the power and actions of the state. And because it operates from the ground up, it has far greater agility and capacity to recognise the processes involved in the earlier stages of state crimes, all of which are actually processes, not singular events. Why do we know about Israel's genocidal crimes? Not because of the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry, which published its findings of genocide this week, a whole 2 years after the annihilation phase of the genocide began, nor because the Association of Genocide Scholars has finally found its conscience, not because our media reports on Israel's genocide and its decades-long persecution of Palestinians, nor because our governments denounce the genocidal state. To the contrary, our media and our governments have been central in sustaining and perpetuating these crimes. We know about Israel's crimes only because, for decades, Palestinian NGOs, critical researchers, Palestinian and other independent, courageous journalists and civil society groups have been documenting, evidencing, analysing, and disseminating their findings. The Israeli crimes embodied in all the stages of genocide have thus been known for many years and include decades-long policies and practices of settler colonialism, ethno-supremacism, apartheid, racial segregation, persecution, unlawful settlements, the denial of the right of return, collective punishment, mass detention, torture, and cruel and inhuman treatment and punishment, extrajudicial executions, systematic sexual violence, house demolitions, forced displacement and expulsions, ethnic purges, and forced demographic change, forced starvation, the systematic denial of all economic and social rights, and extermination. The list is incredibly long and barbaric. Civil society has been at the heart and centre of all evidence gathering in relation to these crimes. And this work by civil society, not by the courts, not by the UN, not by the media, has led efforts to successfully name Israel's crimes as settler colonialism, apartheid, and genocide. Unlike a court of law, the Gaza Tribunal begins from the premise that Israel is committing genocide, that it is a settler colonial apartheid state underpinned by the racist ideology of Zionism. We do not require the hypothetical ruling of an international court, nor the dreadfully belated judgment of a UN independent commission to determine that a genocide is happening, and has been happening incrementally since 1917. The evidence is manifold. Thousands of Palestinian and global civil society organizations, historians, state crime theorists, international relations scholars, philosophers, and international lawyers all agree. We start from a recognition that governments and the international legal order have not simply failed the Palestinians, but they have actively enabled Israel's impunity and partnered its decades-long colonial persecution of the people of Palestine. For us, the challenge of justice and resistance falls to civil society, to acts of solidarity, to social movements, and to people of conscience everywhere. It understands the need to mobilize the power of people in their millions to challenge the crimes of the Israeli regime and its co-conspirators, our own governments in the US, Europe, and the Middle East. The tribunal seeks to counter the forces of evil with the forces of justice by bringing pressure to bear in every sector and making clear that genocide will not be normalized, that apartheid will not be normalized, that colonialism will not be normalized, that Israel and its Zionist underpinnings will not be normalized, and in doing so, ensuring that fascism will not be normalized. We know that the Zionist regime is committed to seeing out its genocide, and we know that its principal genocidal partner, the US government, is equally committed to this genocide and to the erasure of Palestine. At the same time, we know that other Western governments like the UK and Germany and complicit Arab states have fully endorsed Israeli impunity and continue to do so. So the question is, how in the face of such powerful forces of carnage do we stop a genocide? How do we dismantle the Zionist state and those global powers whose ultimate goal is the erasure of Palestine, knowing that law and its international mechanisms are not the answer or not the full answer? The tribunal is clear. Genocide will only end through the steadfastness of the Palestinian people, the solidarity of the rest of the world, and the isolation, weakening, and dismantling of the Zionist regime and the global political and economic structures that support it. And so to the Sarajevo Declaration. At the first session of the Gaza People's Tribunal held in Sarajevo in May this year, the contextual foundations for understanding Israel's genocide were laid. Over the course of 4 days, we heard expert and witness testimony on the history and ideological foundations of the genocide, on the crimes Israel and its partners have committed, and on the geopolitics fueling the genocide and Israel's impunity. The Sarajevo Declaration was the culmination of the work of the tribunal to date. It was both an unequivocal condemnation of Israel's genocide and a clarion cry to global civil society, an urgent call to action and a commitment on the part of the Gaza Tribunal to work with partners across global civil society to bring about an end to the genocide. The declaration embodies a series of demands around which civil society is already organising, demands which speak directly to the myriad crimes against humanity that Israel is perpetrating. The declaration thus demands, inter alia, an immediate withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza and an end to the genocide, to all Israeli military action, to forced displacement and expulsions, to settlement activities, to the siege of Gaza, and to restrictions on movement in the West Bank. It calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all prisoners, including the thousands of Palestinian women, men, and children held most often without charge in abusive Israeli detention facilities. It insists on the immediate resumption of humanitarian aid to all of Gaza without restriction or interference, including food, water, shelter, medical supplies and equipment, sanitary equipment, rescue equipment, and construction materials. It also calls for a complete withdrawal of all the Israeli forces from Lebanese and Syrian territory, and of course would have included a demand for the immediate cessation of Israel's bombings and targeted assassinations in Iran, Yemen, Qatar, and Tunisia, had they occurred before May 2025. The Sarajevo Declaration recognizes that dangerous forces in both the state, corporate, and supra-institutional spheres are pushing us towards the void, toward a future in which humanity itself is threatened. The events of the past 24 months and the tribunal's own deliberations have convinced us that both key international organizations and most countries of the world, whether acting individually or collectively, have not only failed in defending the human rights of the Palestinian people and in responding to the Israeli regime's genocide in Palestine, but have to varying degrees been complicit or actual partners in these crimes. In the declaration, we extend solidarity to global civil society, which has risen up against the genocide in extraordinarily creative and brave ways, but which has encountered McCarthyite suppression and increasing state violence. We denounce the wave of persecution against human rights defenders, peace activists, students, academics, workers, professionals, and we pay tribute to those who, despite this persecution, have had the courage and moral conviction to stand up and speak out, while rejecting the ridiculous Hasbara tactics of smearing as anti-Semitic or supporters of terrorism all those who dare to publicly challenge the Israeli regime and its European and US allies. Significantly, the declaration rejects wholesale the destructive ideology of Zionism, the official state ideology of the Israeli regime. It is the forces of Zionism that colonized Palestine in 1948 and continue to colonize the occupied Palestinian territories. And it is Zionism with its inherent racism that created the Israeli apartheid state on the ruins of traditional Palestine. And it is Zionism, the belief in a Jewish supremacist state, that drives pro-genocidal Israeli organizations and their surrogates on the far right today. The declaration demands immediate action to isolate, contain, and hold accountable the Israeli regime through universal boycott, divestment, sanctions, a military embargo, suspension from international organizations, and the prosecution of all its perpetrators. The final lines of the declaration, as Usta declared, are also worth repeating. The challenge of justice now falls on people of conscience everywhere, to civil society and to social movements, to all of us. Palestinian lives are at stake. The international moral and legal order is at stake. We must not fail. We must not relent. Millions of people continue to march in cities around the world. Civil resistance groups target Israeli-linked armaments factories. Trade unions have blocked weapons shipments to Israel. The BDS movement, particularly through academic and cultural boycotts, has grown in power and impact. And a phenomenal 26,000 people signed up for the global Samud flotilla in an attempt to break the siege of Gaza and create a humanitarian corridor. The message of the Sarajevo Declaration is that, in spite of, because of the forces of darkness we find ourselves surrounded by, we must continue to do everything, everywhere, and at all times to stop Israel's attempts at Palestinian erasure, and at the same time to restore justice and humanity in a world hurtling towards fascism. In his closing address to the final session of the Vietnam War Crimes Tribunal, Bertrand Russell declared in words that equally impel our resistance today, and I quote, "The napalm and pellet bombs, the systematic destruction of a heroic people, are a barbarous rehearsal. The starving and the suffering will no longer die in silence. We must discredit the arrogant demand that they protect our comfort with their quiet agony." Thank you.
cliche, the world's first live-streamed genocide. We're all watching what's happening, and we're watching the failure of institutions that were set up ostensibly to address such situations in absolute terms. I'm going to talk about the United Nations in particular, as you see from the program, and to say that, one of the problems at that building across the street from where you are sitting now in New York is that in the corridors of the UN, there are many parts of the organization that don't dare speak the word genocide. This is despite the fact that genocide is a specific crime defined by the UN Genocide Convention and the Rome Statute, despite the fact that its prevention is a specific duty of the United Nations. And yet, discussions on genocide amongst the political leadership of the organization, the Secretary General, his senior advisors, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, even the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, have carefully avoided even naming the crime for 2 years now. They have an approach that allows reference to genocide only in reference to history, not for genocides that are happening today, certainly and clearly not for the genocide that's been unfolding before our eyes in Palestine for 2 years now. And you will notice, if you follow the UN, that the UN has adopted a rhetorical trick, which is a kind of system-wide talking point to insulate itself from pressure to address ongoing genocides. What they do with this oft-repeated talking point is to say, only a court can determine genocide. Well, that's utterly false in the first instance. But also, if you listen, you will hear that they never make that same claim about other crimes. It never prevents them from talking about torture or summary executions or collective punishment or other crimes. And never mind that they regularly invoke the word terrorism without ever needing a judicial decision, even though there's not even an internationally agreed definition of terrorism at the international level. And never mind that the organization has obligations of prevention, which is logically impossible if you wait for a court to deliver opinion after the fact. The same trick you will hear again and again, uttered not as a matter of principle, but out of fear for complaints from the United States or the United Kingdom or Germany or other powerful states. The hell with the victims. We have to be careful not to have to suffer through a démarche from a powerful state. But words matter, and language will either serve the cause of accountability or it will serve the cause of impunity. And if you refuse to name the disease, you're never going to be able to find the cure. Now, these kinds of distortions with regard to Palestine are not new. The roots of these problems are as old as the UN itself. In 1948, a watershed year for the development of the modern international human rights system, you have the coincidence of the adoption of both the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Genocide Convention on the one hand, but also the horror of the genocidal Nakba that same year on the other. That's more than just a historical contradiction. It was also the birth of a virus, the virus of the Israel exception to international law, that has haunted the organization for decades, carved out space for genocide, and ultimately threatened the very legitimacy and sustainability of the United Nations itself. As the genocide in Palestine is underscored, unlocking these Western-imposed shackles that have compromised the political corridors of the UN, ending the Israel exception to international law, and moving toward the international law-based functioning of the organization is not only urgent, but it is a matter of life or death for the Palestinian people and others, and it is a matter of survival and legitimacy of the United Nations itself. Well, I'm going to say that some of the failures in the UN system to address this genocide have been by design. One can think about the veto in the UN Security Council, which is a design flaw in the organization itself, not a flaw to the designers who did that quite intentionally. But many of the failures are not failures of design, but failures of abdication, a lack of courage, a lack of political will by actors in the international system that do have the power to actually intervene and make a difference. And so what went wrong? Well, long before Israel's assault on Gaza in 2023, the international norms and standards were already in place. They were codified in the UN Charter and international human rights and humanitarian law. The institutions were in place, from the intergovernmental bodies and political offices of the UN to the international tribunals in The Hague. You have already a UN office entirely dedicated to the prevention of genocide, fully staffed and operating at UN headquarters there in New York, A sophisticated multi-layered UN human rights system was functioning with its headquarters in Geneva and offices across the globe, including in Palestine. And yet the genocide has been allowed to continue to rage, supported by complicit governments, undeterred by international institutions, over which states like the US wield disproportionate power. And for their part, the international tribunals have been subjected to unprecedented and sustained campaigns of interference and obstruction and threats and even sanctions, including direct threats from the United States and from Israel and its proxy groups. So, that's the situation where we begin. What then is the problem with the UN, if I can say that? Well, the problem is that there are two UNs. And I think the genocide in Palestine and the lack of a coherent response has emphasized that for us once again. The first UN is the UN of the Charter, of the norms, of the constitutionally grounded in this mission of human rights and peace and development in international law. That's the UN of the human rights treaties, of the independent human rights monitors and mechanisms, of the International Court of Justice. It's the UN in which the use of force is prohibited in all but a few narrowly defined circumstances. It's the UN of decolonization, the UN in which all human beings are free and equal in dignity and rights. It's the UN in which peoples have self-determination as a right. And it's the UN in which colonialism and apartheid and gross violations of human rights and genocide are absolutely prohibited. And it's also the UN in which officials rang the alarm bells of genocide as far back as October of 2023, and in which the UN's special rapporteurs stood up to the attacks of abusive Western governments and ruthless Israel proxies to speak truth to power and to challenge the Israeli regime and its collaborators with law and facts and uncompromising principle. But there's another UN. That's the UN that permitted the colonization of Palestine, that partitioned the land against the will of the indigenous people, that ratified the ethnic cleansing of Palestine by recognizing Israel in 1948, and that tolerated decades of apartheid in Israel and Palestine. It's the UN that suspended the application of international law for 3 decades in favor of a disingenuous political process called Oslo, under which for 3 decades the Palestinians were told they have to negotiate for their rights with their oppressor, and that the mediator of the process would be the world's sole superpower, which also happened to be Israel's closest ally and arms supplier. It's the UN that remained almost entirely silent as genocide raged across the land, trepidatiously avoiding any reference to the crime of genocide or to its root causes. The UN that was even unable to order a ceasefire, as we saw again yesterday with yet another veto in the Security Council, or to hold perpetrators accountable as they openly perpetrated a genocide. Now, as the genocide in Gaza has shown, the veto power of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the only UN body with formal enforcement power, is the most obvious example of failure by design. That power has been used throughout the genocide by the US as Israel's chief ally and co-perpetrator in the genocide to prevent any meaningful act of protection for the Palestinians, any enforcement of international law, or any accountability for Israeli perpetrators. 6 successive vetoes now have been exercised by the United States since October of 2023, bringing its vetoes up to about 50 in protecting Israeli impunity. After each veto, thousands more Palestinians were killed in the ongoing genocide. No sanctions have been imposed by the Council on the perpetrator regime. No military intervention has been mandated. No protection force has been mobilized. No judicial decisions have been enforced by the Council during this period. And the Israeli regime even remains a full member of the United Nations with full privileges, despite its perpetration of the ongoing genocide, serial acts of aggression against its neighbor, and frequent attacks on the United Nations itself, attacks on UN staff, UN facilities. So what can the UN and its member states do to end the genocide, protect its victims, and hold perpetrators to account when a veto-wielding permanent member of the Security Council is itself implicated in the perpetration of the genocide and fully committed to its continuation? We ask, do the jus cogens and erga omnes norms of international law, such as the prohibition of genocide and apartheid and the right to self-determination, do they disappear in the face of a US veto? Or are states and international organizations obliged to take further meaningful action? And I think the answer from both a moral and legal perspective is that they can and they must. And that's where the General Assembly comes in. Now, the General Assembly has a mixed record at best during this genocide. It has convened an emergency special session under the extraordinary procedures of the Uniting for Peace resolution, and it has adopted some important resolutions to respond to the genocide in the face of the captured and moribund Security Council. The General Assembly has declared that all countries must comply with the detailed findings of the International Court of Justice on Palestine. And in the wake of the successive failures by the Council to act, owing to the US veto, the General Assembly has adopted resolutions demanding an immediate ceasefire. Most significantly, it adopted a resolution just a year ago endorsing the entirety of the findings of the International Court of Justice in its advisory opinion of July of 2024, declaring the Israeli occupation to be entirely unlawful and demanding its immediate end, the settlements, the wall, the apartheid system, all to be dismantled, that Palestinians must be allowed to return and be compensated, and that Palestinians do not have to negotiate for their rights with the oppressor. It also called for ending all military, diplomatic, economic activity with the regime as well, and declared that the provisional measures of the International Court of Justice in the genocide case against Israel must be implemented. That action by the General Assembly was historic, and it was adopted with an overwhelming majority, some 90% of the member states of the United Nations, demonstrating that the US and the Israeli regime are isolated. But even as the horror has dragged on and Israel has shattered record after record for civilian bloodletting, the General Assembly has not yet used the full range of the powers that are at its disposal. So I have to say the jury is still out on the General Assembly. If it is unable or unwilling to act decisively to stop the world's first live-stream genocide, it will suffer deep and perhaps fatal wounds to its legitimacy and therefore to its sustainability. The US veto of yesterday's Security Council resolution on Palestine and the expiration on the same day of the deadline set by the General Assembly for Israel's compliance with the findings of the International Court of Justice and the demands of the General Assembly have queued up a historic moment of responsibility for the General Assembly. They could act decisively, as they are empowered to do. They could announce sanctions and a military embargo. They could reject the General Assembly credentials of the Israeli regime. They could establish a criminal tribunal. They could reactivate the UN's anti-apartheid mechanisms. They could mandate a UN protection force to protect civilians, ensure humanitarian aid, preserve evidence of Israeli crimes, and assist in reconstruction. They could do all of that, but of course they have a choice. It could take any and all of those steps, or it could simply remain inactive, or it could adopt another toothless resolution, or a resolution that focuses on tangential issues like the two-state solution while ignoring the genocide as it rages on. Or worse, they could adopt a resolution with terms that ignore Palestinian rights and instead focus on deploying a proxy occupation force or a stabilization force or reinforcing the cruel status quo that existed before October of 2023. The choice that the Assembly makes in the next few days will determine not only the immediate fate of the Palestinian people on the ground, but also the legitimacy of the United Nations and therefore, I believe, the fate of the organization itself. Now, let me just conclude by saying there are others who have not met their obligations in the United Nations. Beyond the intergovernmental bodies, the tendency to compromise UN principles and deference to power, especially the power of the US and its Western allies, has also been evident in the positioning of the UN Secretary General, his senior staff and agency heads, where the Israel exception has been in plain view for these full 2 years. Throughout the perpetration of the genocide, the UN's senior-most political leadership, the Secretary General, the High Commissioner of Human Rights, the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, the Head of Political Affairs, have remained unable or unwilling to directly address the genocide, or even, as I've said, to utter the word, taking refuge behind the safe language of armed conflict or the amorphous promise of a two-state solution someday down the road where the Palestinians will be granted a Bantustan as a consolation prize for genocide, or the necessity of humanitarian aid. They've adopted a kind of both-sidesism, which has failed to recognize the true dynamics on the ground of colonizer and colonized, occupier and occupied, oppressor and oppressed, and now genocidaire and victims. And barely a whisper has been heard about accountability for the Israeli perpetrators. That means that there is a significant reserve of moral and political power in the senior-most podiums in the organization that have been left absolutely untapped. And as a result, root causes, normally the first area of inquiry and conflict resolution, have been almost entirely ignored in successive diplomatic and political processes on Palestine. They are left instead for the consideration of human rights mechanisms, but find no place in the political processes. The seizure of Palestine in 1948, the colonization of Palestine, the theft of land and homes within the Green Line, the ethno-nationalist state, the system of apartheid, the systemic gross inequalities, official racism and dehumanization, the plight of generations of Palestinian refugees, colonial domination, none of these have received a hint of attention in the statements of the political leadership or in the succession of failed political processes launched at Oslo and beyond. This despite the fact that it is now recognized as axiomatic that sustainable conflict resolution cannot succeed without attention to root causes. And perhaps worse, the political offices under the direct authority of the Secretary General, including those responsible for political affairs, the prevention of genocide, sexual violence in armed conflict, and children in armed conflict, have not only largely ignored the genocide in Palestine, but in some cases, under external Western political pressure and without exercising the most basic level of due diligence, have non-critically endorsed or disseminated the Israeli regime's fabricated propaganda for genocide and its justifications for international crimes. For months, as the genocide raged, and as human rights monitors and UN officials and the UN's rapporteur on Palestine and genocide scholars rang the alarm bell, the Office of the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide remained entirely silent on the carnage in Gaza. When she finally issued a statement after a global wave of criticism for her silence, and calls from within the UN for her resignation and a determination by the ICJ that charges of genocide against Israel were plausible, even then she managed only a weak, equivocal statement that echoed the already weak and equivocal statements of the Secretary General and took note of the orders of the ICJ, and on balance expressed more concern for the perpetrator state than for the victims of genocide in Palestine. And so it was with the Special Advisor on sexual violence and armed conflict and the Special Advisor on children in armed conflict who distorted the mechanisms they were charged with directing in order to accommodate Israeli impunity again and again and again. Now, I want to finish with 3 points of light. First, the principled role of the independent UN human rights mechanisms, in sharp contrast to the historic failings of the political offices reporting to the Secretary General. The independent human rights mechanisms mandated by the Human Rights Council have maintained a principled law-based approach to their human rights monitoring and reporting duties. Despite massive pressure from Israel, its proxies, and its Western allies, and ongoing harassment, these independent special procedures have exhaustively documented Israel's crimes, affirmed its culpability for genocide, and helped maintain public attention to the genocide in Palestine. And that an especially important role has been played by Francesca Albanese, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territory, in the face of sustained, well-funded, well-organized campaigns of harassment, smears, death threats, and sanctions by the United States and attacks by the government of Israel. Francesca Albanese has been undeterred, producing a series of meticulously documented analytical reports on the genocide and its colonial roots, and maintaining a continuous visible media presence and close collaboration with civil society, especially in Palestine. And other mandate holders as well have worked diligently, both individually and collectively, to defend the human rights of the people of Palestine and to build the case for accountability for Israeli perpetrators, despite all of the pressures. Notice that throughout the genocide, the contrast between the principled, fact-based, law-centered, and accountability-focused approach of the human rights mechanisms of the UN on the one hand, and the equivocal, politicized, and trepidatious rhetoric of the Secretariat on the other could not be more stark. Secondly, and I'm not going to say anything about this much, but the International Court of Justice is also a part of the UN that deserves some recognition. You have to realize, indeed, that it is historic that today the Israeli regime is on trial for genocide. And the court has issued several rounds of provisional measures. It has found the regime guilty of apartheid and racial segregation, and it has held that the occupation of Palestine is entirely unlawful and must end. And then lastly, there are heroes in the United Nations as well, especially the humanitarian workers and a host of agencies, foremost among them the people of UNRWA, who to this day continue to operate in the depths of Gaza's hell to support the survivors of genocide, despite the smears of the Israeli regime and its collaborators in Washington and Europe, despite the bombs and the bullets and the widespread destruction, despite the targeting of UN facilities, the abduction and torture of countless UNRWA staff, and the murder of more than 370 of them just in the last 2 years, many along with their families. They continue to help to relieve the suffering of their neighbors. They represent the best of the UN. They embody its highest principles. They deserve our unwavering solidarity, and yet they have been abandoned by the political leadership of the organization. This is not the UN that the public expects to be in place in the face of a genocide. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Statement. However, my timekeeping capacity has been limited, and doing so by chat has not succeeded. So, Michael, you have 15 minutes, but I will just note that I will give you an audible signal when you exceed that, rather than trying to do so through chat. And so the floor is yours, Michael.
Justice and dealing with Palestine. At one level, these three cases represent an extraordinary level of attention being paid to Palestine when, over the last 60 years, there really only ever had been one substantive case heard by the ICJ on this issue, the 2004 advisory opinion on the legality of the separation apartheid wall built by Israel, largely within the occupied Palestinian territory. That particular case from 2004 determined that the construction of the wall was contrary to the 1907 Hague Regulations and the 1949 Geneva Conventions, among other international instruments, and that the wall must be dismantled with reparations going to those Palestinians harmed and injured by its presence. It would come as no surprise to you that the wall advisory opinion of the ICJ, while it had an important ripple effect in law, its ruling was entirely disregarded by Israel. It was never enforced by the UN, despite an affirmative resolution by the General Assembly welcoming the advisory opinion. The International Court of Justice had not only dismissed Israel's security justifications for the construction of the wall, but it also concluded that Israel was breaching the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people and Israel's obligations as an occupying power under both international humanitarian law and international human rights law. But at another level, it's not surprising that a host of applications and requests for advisory opinions on Palestine have been adjudicated by the ICJ over the past 2 years. Why do I say that? Well, first of all, let's keep in mind that Palestine is the oldest continuous unresolved item on the UN agenda. It was placed there in April 1947, over 78 years ago, and we are further away today from a just and durable resolution than we have ever been. The UN General Assembly has said that the resolution of the question of Palestine shall remain, and in their words, a permanent responsibility of the United Nations until it is satisfactorily resolved in all of its aspects. As well, keep in mind that there's no occupation or zone of conflict in the modern world that has attracted so many UN resolutions and so many pronouncements on international law, both in proclamations and in scholarship, as the question of Palestine has, and yet there's no zone of conflict where international law has been so distant from the aspirations of whom it's supposed to be protecting. And thirdly, diplomatically and politically, Kofi Annan, the former UN Secretary General, said in his 2012 memoirs, and I'm quoting, "Israel-Palestine is not simply one unresolved problem among many. No other issue," he said, "carries such a powerful symbolic and emotional charge affecting people far from the zone of conflict." So what was once only a trickle of litigation before the ICJ on Palestine has now become a flood. So the first of the three cases that I want to briefly take you through is the application by South Africa under the 1948 Genocide Convention, alleging that Israel has been committing genocide in the conduct of its war on Gaza. Now, interestingly, This application was made by South Africa at the very end of December 2023, when Israel's war following the Hamas attacks on October 7th, 2023, was less than 3 months old. But even by that time, the scale of indiscriminate destruction by Israel on Gaza, the huge numbers of civilians' deaths and injuries caused by that time, and the unfiltered genocidal rhetoric coming from Israeli political leaders and influencers persuaded the court, after a 2-day hearing in mid-January, that South Africa's application that Israel might be in breach of the Genocide Convention was plausible, and that a full hearing with the benefit of a richer range of evidence and arguments was justified. So when the ICJ issued its interim ruling at the end of January 2024, saying it would hear full arguments on this, it also issued 3 legally binding provisional measures, which directed Israel to take all measures within its power to prevent the commission of all acts within the scope of the Genocide Convention. It also ordered Israel, with immediate effect, to ensure that its military did not commit any of the acts described in this first order on genocide. And as well, it had to take effective measures to prevent the destruction and ensure the preservation of evidence related to the allegation of acts within the scope of the Genocide Convention was preserved. South Africa went back to the court 2 months later in March of 2024 and asking for further provisional measures, pointing out that Israel was not in obedience of the first range of legally binding orders. The court issued further orders ordering Israel to allow the unhindered preservation at scale of all concerned of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance, including obviously food, fuel, water, clothing, shelter, hygiene, and medical supplies and medical care. It also said that Israel had to ensure with immediate effect that it was not violating committing any acts that would violate the rights of the Palestinians under the Genocide Convention. Then South Africa went back again a third time in May of 2024, and the International Court of Justice issued a third set of provisional measures. You and I might know them as injunctions, ordering that Israel halt its military offensive in Rafah at the south of Gaza and open the Rafah border with Egypt, allowing for humanitarian aid at scale. None of these were obeyed by Israel. We're now at the point where there's been extensive filings by South Africa. I'm led to believe it's in the many hundreds of pages in terms of its written argument that's been requested by the court. Now Israel had been given, I think, initially 6 months to reply. Israel asked for 6 more months, I believe, to make its written submissions, which the court, alas, had granted. And I think Israel has now, somewhere around the end of this year, the beginning of 2026, to make its full filings. There'll be subsequent filings back and forth, and we're not likely to wind up having oral arguments made in front of the court till sometime probably later in 2026, roughly, or around a year from now. I do want to point out that there have been a number of countries, I believe the number is around 14 now, who have requested the right to intervene, all on the side of South Africa. And Brazil, I believe, announced either yesterday or today that it's made application to the ICJ to want to be able to intervene on this case. We're not if my timetable is right, we're not likely to hear, if hearings are not going to be conducted in front of the ICJ until towards the latter part of 2026. We're not likely to get a decision out of the court until sometime in 2027. And if you're wondering, like I am, as to why it's taking so long for the ICJ to turn to hearing the matter and deciding on the merits of the case, I'm also wondering the same thing. 1 or 2 more things I just want to point out that's important with respect to the genocide case. There is a prior case that's likely to be heard by and argued in front of the court sometime later this year or early next year, in a case brought by the Gambia against Myanmar with respect to genocide being committed by Myanmar against the Rohingya people. Interestingly, there's intervention by several global North countries, including Netherlands and my country, Canada, to the court, seeking to broaden the definition of genocidal intent. The court 10 years ago, in a genocide case involving Croatia and Serbia, it had ruled that genocidal intent could be inferred from conduct if it is the only inference that can reasonably be drawn from the acts in question. Many scholars have criticized that as being too narrow and too high a bar of intent to be able to establish genocide. And the court is now being given, if you like, a chance by these submissions coming from these global North countries on the side of the Gambia to widen or loosen the definition so the bar would be set somewhat lower in establishing genocidal intent. And if that winds up happening, that will likely make it easier for the court to come to the conclusion when it does hear and then adjudicates and decides South Africa's application against Israel, that Israel is committing genocide. But I should point out that I think the impact of all of the reports coming from civil society, and particularly coming from my successor, Francesca Albanese, and now this report issued on Tuesday by the International Independent Commission of Inquiry set up by the Human Rights Council, I think is going to have a significant role in the arguments to be heard in front of the court and in the court's deliberations. If we look at the case I'm going to now talk about in a minute, which is the ruling from last July 2024 on whether or not the occupation by Israel of Palestine is unlawful, the court did rely heavily on prior reports by the Independent Commission of Inquiry, as well as some civil society organizations as well. So I think if this substantive report issued on Tuesday by the Commission of Inquiry, 72 pages long, 495 footnotes, a model, I think, of a carefully argued case with respect to genocide. If that is in front of the court, as it will be, I think the court, given its past recent practice on what it accepts and what it pays attention to in terms of coming to its decisions, will have a significant shaping of how the court rules on this particular case. The second case I want to talk about very briefly, and I'm mindful of my time, is the ICJ's ruling in July 2024 on an advisory opinion requested in December 2022 by the General Assembly with respect to whether or not Israel's continued occupation of East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza is now unlawful. And I think we're probably, all of us are quite familiar with both the what led up to this case, but also what the ruling was by the ICJ. It was based upon, in many ways, influenced by the seminal decision released by the court way back in 1971 with respect to South Africa's unlawful continuation of its mandate over ruling of Southwest Africa or Namibia. And in many ways, those cases were parallel, were very close to each other. There was a record number of states and international organizations who appeared for 6 days in front of the ICJ in The Hague in February of 2024, making these arguments. And the court released, I think it's, again, a seminal decision. I think probably one of the most important 3 or 4 rulings that the court has ever made in July of 2024, finding that Israel's occupation was unlawful, that the Israeli settlements were illegal and were in fact a cornerstone of Israel's continued unlawful occupation, and that it was in violation of the Palestinians' right to self-determination, and also was a violation of the prohibition of acquiring territory by force or by war, i.e. illegal annexation. The ICJ in its ruling mandated Israel to end its unlawful presence, cease settlement activities, and to make reparations to Palestinians, while also obliging all other states and international organizations to wind up complying with this in order to ensure that Israel ended its occupation in terms of the wording of the ICJ ruling as rapidly as possible. And of course, 2 months later, a year ago yesterday, the General Assembly, sitting in a special session, ruled overwhelmingly, they adopted a resolution welcoming overwhelmingly the ICJ advisory opinion, and they wound up giving Israel exactly 12 months to completely end the occupation, to dismantle all of its 360 plus settlements and remove its 750,000 plus settlers from East Jerusalem and the West Bank, and to enable a swift path to Palestinian self-determination. We all know that that deadline ended yesterday. Israel remains in full defiance of both the ICJ advisory opinion and the direction of the international community speaking through this General Assembly resolution. I think we're now probably coming to an existential moment with respect to the United Nations, as echoed by what Craig had said, both with the defiance of this one-year deadline and with respect to the decision to continue with the genocide in Gaza, in stark opposition to the overwhelming diplomatic and popular opinion expressed around the world, which we again saw yesterday with a vote of 14-1 at the Security Council, seeking an immediate and durable ceasefire in Gaza. It's what I think Abraham Lincoln said during one of his cabinet meetings, where he was the only person to vote in favor of a particular item against his cabinet. And he said the vote was 14-1, the nays have it. And this is the same thing that happened yesterday. The nays have it at the Security Council in a 14-1 vote. Okay, thank you very much for that. The third and final item in front of the International Court of Justice involving Palestine was a request for an advisory opinion, another advisory opinion asked for by the General Assembly in December 2024 on a priority basis and with utmost urgency, in the words of the resolution, to render an advisory opinion on the obligations of Israel as the occupying power and as a member of the UN with respect to providing and facilitating the unhindered provision of urgently needed supplies essential to the survival of the Palestinian civilian population. This was presented to the court. The court made room in its schedule to have 5 days of argument at the end of April and beginning of May. And there were, again, a large number of states that wound up intervening in front of the court, making arguments that Israel was in breach of its charter obligations and in breach of a number of international instruments as an occupying power by denying and hindering humanitarian aid going into Gaza. I point out the fact that this advisory opinion was asked for at the end of December when things were bad. But by the time it reached the court at the end of April, things were desperate, with Israel having imposed in early March a complete 11-week blockade of all humanitarian aid from entering into Gaza. I think we can expect a decision, I think, sometime in October or November from the court on this advisory opinion request. And it almost certainly will find that Israel is in full breach of all of its obligations as an occupying power. And I think the fact that this has been decided by the court on a relatively quick basis will also be influential on how the court winds up determining the question of genocide in a year and a half or 2 years from now with regards to this. The only thing I want to say in conclusion, Ashley, and thank you for the extension of time, is that we are always faced with the question of law versus power, as most of my predecessor speakers have mentioned. Law in the service of power versus law in the service of justice is always going to be, if you like, an internal struggle within international law. At any one time, power may have precedence over justice, or it may wind up being reversed. And where I think we're seeing now with these 3 decisions that have been decided or in the course of trying to be decided and adjudicated at the International Court of Justice, there's an attempt by those people of conscience to use international law as it is to ensure that international politics develops the will to enforce all of these decisions and all of these obligations. Without that, we're all going to be lost. Thank you very much.
Very enlightening presentation on the status of multiple of the pending cases before the ICJ, as well as the resolved case from 2024. Bossam, we now turn to one of our in-person presenters, and it will be welcome to have your voice here present with us in the room. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Asla, and distinguished members of the tribunal, friends, comrades in struggle. I don't speak to you today under the banner of any organization. I speak in my personal capacity, stripped of the institutional affiliation I once had, but not stripped of the conviction that brought me into this work in the first place. I'm here in my personal capacity because I was forced to resign, because the truth makes some people uncomfortable. But let me be clear, I have not given up on the truth. Al-Haq, the organization I once served, means the truth in Arabic. And that truth is not an office, it's not a contract, it's not subject to sanctions, it's a principle, it's a commitment, it's a struggle. The truth is, in July 2024, the International Court of Justice issued its advisory opinion. It confirmed what we have always known, that Israel's occupation is illegal, that it violates the right to self-determination, and that is a system sustained by annexation, apartheid, and dehumanization. The truth is, on September 18, 2024, the United Nations General Assembly gave Israel 1 year to end its illegal occupation. That deadline expired yesterday. And the truth is, Israel has not only not complied, it has escalated. The truth is, Israel has continued its genocidal campaign, not only through bombs, starvation, famine now. Just a few days ago, the UN Commission of Inquiry confirmed what we already knew, that Israel has committed genocide, and it continues to do so with impunity. The intent to destroy a people has been made plain. Gaza has not been defended, it has been destroyed. Over 60,000 are dead, entire families are gone, and still the bombs fall, siege tightens, the world hesitates. The truth is, while Gaza is turned to ash, the West Bank is being smothered. Iron gates, checkpoints, armed settlers, paved roads of exclusion, laws of separation, entire villages locked in, children cut off from schools, farmers cut off from land. This is not just an occupation. This is control, this is apartheid, this is settler colonialism. Settler violence is not a byproduct, it is a policy, a weapon of displacement, protected, armed, and unpunished. This past year has been a microcosm of impunity, a window into the settler colonial regime's worst instincts unleashed with zero restraint. The truth is, the world did not need a year to witness that Israel has no intention of ending the occupation. It never did, because this occupation is not temporary. It's the backbone of a settler colonial enterprise. And that occupation is not merely prolonged, it is permanent by design. This is not just about military control, it's about the denial of a people's right to exist with dignity, sovereignty, and freedom. The truth is, the Israeli government's contempt for international law is not born in a vacuum. It is the product of decades of Western complicity. The arms shipments, the diplomatic cover, the unspoken green light, all of it makes the law feel like a lie to Palestinians. The truth is, this past year has not been an aberration. It has been a mirror, a reflection of decades of impunity, of an apartheid regime that sees every legal challenge as a delay, not a deterrent, a settler colonial regime that views international law as a game and Palestinian lives as disposable. The truth is, the ICJ's opinion was a landmark, but it was not a turning point, because turning points require action, not just words. And what we've seen is not action, but abandonment. The truth is, impunity at the top trickles down. It trickles into every rifle cocked at a child, every settler attack that goes unpunished, every bulldozer crushing a home, and every courtroom that never sees a war criminal. The truth is, this is not just an Israeli crime, it's an international one, because silence is not neutrality, it is complicity. Because military aid, diplomatic cover, and unconditional trade are not acts from a distance. they are acts of participation. And that is why earlier today, a group of UN experts warned the international community's continued failure to uphold the law and Israel's refusal to comply with the ICJ's opinion and the General Assembly resolution represent a crisis of accountability. This inaction enables and fuels Israel's continued colonization, apartheid, and occupation, and encourages its sense of impunity. The truth is, legal clarity already exists. What remains missing is political courage. The truth is, I may no longer be speaking on behalf of al-Haq, but I still seek the truth, because the truth cannot be suspended, cannot be sanctioned, it cannot be erased. The truth lives in every child who survives, in every voice who bears witness, in every page of every report that tells the story of a crime no one wanted documented. The truth is, this tribunal is a mechanism for evidence, a mechanism for memory, action, for resistance. It's a people's court. It's a rupture in the wall of silence. It's a future archive of accountability. To the world, I say the deadline has passed. The red lines are no longer red. They're soaked in blood. There must be consequences. Arms embargoes, diplomatic sanctions, economic pressure, international trials, and reparations, not pity. We demand self-determination, not slogans, return, not rhetoric, freedom, not framing. Final truth is, this did not begin in 2023, 1967, or in 1948. It began with the colonization of Palestine, and it will not end until that colonization is dismantled. The lack of action to confront the continued colonization of Palestine has led to the amplification, the imperial and colonial ambitions to turn Gaza into a real estate venture, a return to a terra nullius mindset of the colonialism we thought was a thing of the past. But the truth is, we're still here, we're still documenting, still resisting, still speaking, still being. The truth is not going away, and neither are we. Thank you.
Thank you, Wissam, so much. And with that, we will turn now to Professor Wadia Saeed. And Wadia, the floor is yours. Once more, I give you 15 minutes.
I wanted to particularly also note Wissam's incredibly powerful remarks, especially in light of what has been done, I guess you could say, to al-Haq and other Palestinian human rights groups. That, you know, is an unfortunate and outrageous abuse of discretion by the U.S. government, and I know that it takes particular courage and particular fortitude after these many decades of work and struggle for him to be here. And I say that not just because I'm moved by the remarks, but also because I'm here in this final kind of speaker role as a Palestinian, yes, but I can't possibly claim to speak for our people in this particular role. However, I will say that, and I believe there are many who would agree with me, that international popular support and the role of people the world over has been remarkable, whether we're talking about bike races in Spain, or, you know, governmental action, football matches in Morocco, or street protests there, the repeated hundreds of thousands of people who demonstrate in Yemen every week, despite the fact that their country is under attack and has been for quite some time, even before October 7th, and by groups other than, or countries other than the Israelis, whether it's the people in Britain who rise up against banning of a peaceful action group or a peaceful group like Palestine Action to declare their support and risk arrest, whether it's the largest demonstrations, I think, in the history of Australia, whether it's the South African government and people supporting supporting a lawsuit at the ICJ, whether it's students across the world, but particularly in universities here in the United States who risk a great deal to demonstrate against the genocide in Gaza. Now we also see the repeated efforts of those on behalf of the Freedom Flotilla. These are incredibly moving events. And now we've also seen international celebrities, artists, writers, government workers, journalists. I mean, the list goes on. And of course, I will fail to do any type of justice to the level of sacrifice that we've seen by many, 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 many people the world over. So I apologize for, not mentioning even the slightest, even the most fair number of people around the world who have sacrificed so much for Palestine. And the question is, why would they do this? Okay, because there's very little to gain and a great deal to lose from supporting Palestinians, especially at the governmental level or in the private and public sector, particularly, I think, when we focus on the global north or the west, if you want to call it. So what could possibly animate this? And I think it's a matter of basic fairness. So I think many of us, if not all of us here on this panel and beyond, have had encounters with whether it's students or interlocutors or just ordinary people we interact with who would decry international law's unenforceability. Oh, that's not binding. Or, oh, international law can't enforce itself. So that's, I think, and others, of course, have covered this, that's a major reason why we are engaged in this event, this endeavor, a Gaza People's Tribunal, a popular tribunal, right? It's why we're animated to try to do something as, more direct methods of enforcement, protection forces, or large governments with massive amounts of influence basically stand silent, or even worse, are complicit, as we've seen here in the United States and obviously elsewhere. So when an apartheid state engages in a genocidal campaign, what is it that people are doing? They're responding to the scope of the horror by demanding it stop. Now, to be sure, we also all know that there were plenty of outrages before, that the Israeli government has engaged in many violations of Palestinians' rights and killed people before and tortured people and imprisoned people without charge, and expropriated land and carried out its campaign to deny the Palestinians any type of rights over many, 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 many decades, going back well before October 7th and 1967 and even 1948. Right? Wissam, I think, just mentioned that. Okay. So why is it that people would do this? Okay. There's a simple basic. Why is it that people would actually challenge this, is I guess what I'm asking. And it's because there's a simple basic issue of fundamental fairness. Okay, there's a simple basic issue of fundamental fairness that people are drawn to. And there I think we can take international law in the sort of best possible spin on the horror that we are living through. We take international law as a kind of a guide or a kind of a statement on basic fairness, that people should be treated the same. They should enjoy certain rights that are universal in their application. And here, I hope you'll indulge me by allowing me to just turn the focus back to here in the United States, where there's a system, right? Where there's a system in place that exists. And it's a government line, and it's reflected in legal structures that basically denies Palestinians any access to justice or rights by insisting that groups resisting apartheid and occupation peacefully or otherwise are terroristic. Okay, so here in the United States, we have a system where we declare, where the president or the secretary of state, to be more precise, declares groups to be foreign terrorist organizations, and all sorts of negative legal consequences flow from that. And I've written a lot about that and talked a lot about that. And I'm not going to kind of get into the legal weeds of that today. I'm going to focus more on what that means more broadly, about the fact that here we have a government that basically unilaterally declares a group as terroristic. And that's a potentially permanent status, okay? And that in essence basically renders anything else that that group does as invalid, okay? And in the United States context, the poster child of the terrorist group is the Islamic resistance movement, Hamas, okay? So as the world, even more so than Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State, the model of the terrorist organization in the American official gaze is the Hamas movement. Okay, so that renders Palestinians also as adjacent to, in their group that calls itself a resistance movement, that renders them in the American official view as terroristic. So when we've seen government spokespeople, U.S. government spokespeople say that everything that has happened in Gaza is the fault of Hamas, right? This has been a new line that the Trump administration has taken on and pushed rather, I think it's kind of obscene, but they push it in an aggressive manner. They are reflecting, or these views reflect this idea of the permanent terroristic status of the group here, right? And the Israeli logic, of course, appreciates the American approach and makes use of it as well. And we've also seen that the Israelis have tried to make use of international law, okay, by constantly referring to their right to self-defense. International law has a few basic requirements, maybe one really of when a state can go to war, and that's when it's attacked, and so it can fight back in self-defense. And so we see that phrase trotted out over and over again, even as, you can see the Israeli Air Force, for example, or drone force, or whoever it is, bombing tents and bombing people in buildings with no armed people anywhere near there. Well, they must have been human shields that are being used by the terrorist group. And this is really a self-defense. This is really an action in self-defense. Okay. People, when they see that, even through the filter of the horribly biased corporate media here in the global north, the United States, et cetera, they've been conditioned by the concept of the status of the group as a terrorist group, and the media constantly reinforcing that message, and government spokespeople also repeating it. But at some point, the scale of the horrors, I think I mentioned earlier, becomes too much, and people, insist on believing their eyes as opposed to the narrative that has been structured. Okay. Similarly, I think when we talk about this issue of genocide, and we've all again experienced this idea, for example, that this is an issue of status. This can't be a genocide. Well, how come? Well, the Israelis could kill everyone, but they don't, right? They haven't. That means it's not a genocide. Okay. They're just focused on dealing with this terrorist organization. The status, again, overwhelms the discussion of reality, which people are refusing more and more and more to believe. Okay. Another example, sometimes these examples actually come to life or are, kind of admitted out loud in ways we may or may not really be expecting. So, for example, after the ICC issued arrest warrants for Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Gallant, the Washington Post ran a remarkable editorial, and I don't say that in a positive light, where they basically said, look, you know, the ICC, it's not for countries like Israel. It shouldn't be doing this. Okay, it shouldn't be getting involved. Okay, again, why not? Well, the Israelis, their status is as the op-ed, or excuse me, the editorial board's piece in the Washington Post mentioned, the Israelis, they're a democracy. So they have ways of investigating themselves. As a result, the ICC isn't the place for them. Their status allows them to kind of escape any type of accountability, which is meant for other countries and groups that are not quite at that exalted height. Okay. So we're stuck in this world where we have to fight against all these preconceived notions. And the most remarkable thing is that despite the severity of the onslaught on the ground in Gaza and on our senses through official channels, governmental media, etc., people are refusing to believe it. They're refusing to believe the same old story like they may have in the past, when the Palestinian issue, to be sure, was a serious case of the longest military occupation in modern history with all sorts of outrages. But it didn't quite move them the way this flagrant attempt to genocide a people, who continue to resist, by the way, by staying in the face of this momentous and barbaric assault by the Israeli military. People refuse, okay? People refuse, and they even take risks that are, I think, from my perspective as a Palestinian, right? The latest, I think, one that I would cite is dock workers in the city of Ravenna in Italy have refused to load ammunition on trucks to ships to go to Israeli ports. Is just one example, but the latest one that I came up with today, or was brought to my attention today. This level of solidarity and level of support that people around the world are expressing is truly remarkable. And I think it's something that will inspire us here on the Gaza People's Tribunal to adequately address, even if it's only rhetorical, and even if it is only words on paper, but at least rise to the moment and express our level of support and solidarity with the people suffering this genocidal attempt as they attempt to, continue to cling on to their hopes for their freedom and justice and liberation one day. Thank you.
Okay, so with that, we've had our final presentation, and now we can open the floor to questions or have a broader discussion amongst those who are in the audience, if that would be of interest. But where I was ending in response to Wadia's presentation is to note that, as he's described, there is and also this echoes some of the remarks that Penny made earlier, there is a worldwide civil society-led refusal to be complicit and engage in collusion, particularly in those countries where the government and the state is most adamantly determined to continue its unequivocal support of Israel's conduct, financial, military, and otherwise. And the tribunal is an opportunity to think about how that reality, that dissonance, can be captured and mobilized to generate political will in the places where that disconnect between the people and the government is most acute. Now, there are other parts of the world where there's also, I think, likely an acute disconnect between, for example, younger people within the societies and their governments, where it strikes me as a bit more challenging. And so one question I would have is thinking about how one might mobilize Arab governments that have also been collusive and complicit, but have fewer channels through which the political mobilization of youth or their people is viable in light of the security states that they operate, and in any case can be heard, can be channeled meaningfully to those who are in power. So it's just one of many questions I think we can think about as we look out at the basic model of political mobilization through the framework of law that the tribunal represents in its continuity from Bertrand Russell to today, and how it may be impactful in different parts of the world differently, what we can hope for, and what we would look to a jury of conscience to do. What ideally would be the findings that Dr. Mutunga and others will be coming to at the conclusion of the work of the tribunal. So these are some, I think, questions that we might be able to fruitfully discuss, but anyway, the floor is open. Yes, Phyllis, please.
Thank you all for.
Is there a microphone?
Yes,
that we can...
it jams when they speak, so it would be great if you just summarize the question.
Okay, so I'll summarize the question once you've.
So I just wanted to reflect on something that I think is a model for how to mobilize civil society in a way that takes into account these rather extraordinary groups, General Assembly, etc. And that is to look at the model of 1980s era anti-apartheid movement around South Africa, when we saw a very similar parallel when many countries were bringing resolutions to the Security Council. Then go to the General Assembly, resolution would be passed with enormous majorities, but it would then be announced that, well, it doesn't matter because the GA resolutions are not binding. What happened was those resolutions became sort of menus of operations, of actions that individual member states could take. It didn't have to be collective processes. It didn't have to come from the GA as a whole. Member states, one after another, began to pass resolutions in their own parliaments, in their own laws, their own decision-making, where they started imposing banking sanctions, food sanctions. Crucially, that kind of military arms embargoes that we now demand to be applied to Israel. And because of that, the US became more and more isolated, particularly when the later batch, which were the Europeans and other US allies, took up this position. Isolated the US enough that eventually the US government itself had to cave in and allow the very strong movement that already existed in the US, led by the Black Caucus of Congress and Black churches, primarily as students, that were able to pass laws here finally imposed sanctions. And when the Reagan administration vetoed it, they were able to get enough votes to override the veto. So all of that, I think, provides a model for us. We know it can work because we saw it work 30, 40 years ago. The challenge before us is that of time. This is a genocide where we don't have time for immediate reactions. So we have to figure out a way to condense that time to make it the urgency of now. So I would just pose that as a sort of model.
So just by way of summary, Phyllis noted that the work that occurred in the 1980s to isolate and increasingly ratchet up pressure on South Africa through the General Assembly at a time when the Security Council was similarly paralyzed from acting as a consequence of US and at that time UK vetoes, is a model that we could draw upon. And those resolutions provided a menu of options for states to guide their own individual action, even if they didn't have the force of compulsory Security Council resolutions. So menu of options around sanctions, around cultural isolation, around arms embargoes. Also, although she didn't mention it, the idea of withholding credentials from participation of the representatives of that state from participating in the General Assembly is also a precedent that was set in the South Africa context. And these are precisely the kinds of things that we're debating now. The challenge is that the parallel fails when we think about the time scale. And so the question is the urgency of now. That was a strategy that wasn't limited to the 1980s. It began in the 1960s, far preceded the Sharpeville massacre, and then continued and came to fruition over a course of some 4 decades. And actually, there have been parallels all throughout those 4 decades and since between the South African and Palestinian cases. They were recognized explicitly as being parallel cases of incomplete decolonization by those same states at that same time. The non-aligned movement, the G77, all of them saw the similarities of the two cases. Where they diverge is that now we're talking about a genocide the timescale of which is far more urgent. And so the question on the table is, how might we adapt from the example set in the South African case to meet the urgency of the current moment on Palestine? And I think we began to hear some of the answers to that question, but this might be a time to think about what is the UN General Assembly's deadline for action has passed yesterday. What are the kinds of actions that beyond South Africa, where you never had Uniting for Peace, how might Uniting for Peace add to the menu of possibilities in a way that could address the urgency of the moment? And I welcome any panelists. Obviously, Wissam addressed this question to some extent in his remarks. I think Craig alluded to this as well in his remarks, and anybody else who might want to speak to Uniting for Peace or other ways that the South Africa precedent could be built upon here. Yeah, panelists, you are welcome to intervene.
Craig is on.
Yeah, Craig, go ahead, please.
And settler colonialism and the supremacist regime that has been established over the top of the indigenous Palestinian people. And I think that's why this approach is so important, because, you know, I mean, we all remember that straight through the 1980s, the United States was supporting the apartheid regime in South Africa. It had Nelson Mandela registered as a terrorist, well beyond that as well. Others in the West providing support. And it was only through movements of people that was ultimately rendered unsustainable. And the same thing will be true in Palestine. And so it's a reminder that whatever we're doing in the immediate term here, there has to be a commitment to boycott and divestment and sanctions and education and mobilization and demonstrations and civil disobedience and, you know, not allowing the normalization of these horrors, right? In the immediate term, that's what's happening across the street as well. You know, you have this drumbeat that's been building for the last couple of years, the last year in particular, that was shifting away from both sidesism and stabilization and preserving the status quo, and was for the first time in history looking at Israeli accountability, looking at the rights of the Palestinian people that don't have to be negotiated with their oppressor. And that's why you have so much movement around things like the New York Declaration, which from my perspective is a terrible declaration. It is loaded with things that are deeply offensive to the notion of human rights. It seems to be, to me, another attempt to try to create, to legitimize, to normalize, to create space for the Israeli regime, rather than to continue the drumbeat of accountability that has been hinted at in the International Court of Justice, in the International Criminal Court, and the recent findings of Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and everybody else that has looked at this honestly, and to return to as things were before. And if we lose that momentum, that's not the end of the movement, but that is the end of an opportunity that might not soon show itself again. Yesterday's deadline went by with a whisper, and I think it's our job to turn it into a scream, because there has been a promise on the part of the member states of the UN to adopt additional measures at the expiration of that deadline. And if those additional measures are the milquetoast resolution that they put before the Security Council yesterday and that they knew would be vetoed anyway, or worse, you know, this stabilization force idea, which has no chance of going forward anyways, then we will have lost something. And so I think The only principled demands now in the United Nations are coming from civil society, and they are demands to continue the drumbeat of accountability, to follow what we learned in the struggle against South Africa, the solidarity movement against South Africa, which was a movement in solidarity with the resistance in South Africa. We similarly have to be in solidarity with the resistance and the steadfastness of the Palestinian people and Palestine, and we have to be pushing institutions to do things like mandate a protection force, to do things like reactivating the anti-apartheid mechanisms in the UN to address Israeli apartheid, to do things like sanctions. The General Assembly can enforce sanctions, but it can adopt sanctions, it can monitor sanctions, it can expand sanctions. The same thing with the military embargo, the same thing with rejecting Israel's credentials as has been done with South Africa. So there's a lot of lessons that have been drawn from South Africa there, BDS being the first one, but these other measures at the UN, I think, being important in their own way as well. Over.
Failings, and it might be useful if we had a moment of conversation about what those are beyond the failure to use the human rights framework. But that is the work of the only group of states that have emerged in a sort of express the solidarity of states from across the world, like global North states joining with China, joining with states from South America, Africa, and the Middle East in expressing outrage in the Hague group. And it's a group that is organized around the idea of accountability. They literally define themselves in terms of supporting international law and international institutions at a time that they're under so much pressure, specifically because of Israel. And yet what they produce ultimately is the New York Declaration. So the question, I guess, is what are the pathways to leverage in the General Assembly to get to a resolution that more closely resembles something along the lines that Phyllis and Craig have articulated, rather than what was put before the Security Council yesterday, or what is more conventionally the habits of delegations in New York. Again, open question, and there may be other questions from the audience as well, but are there? Am I seeing a hand? Okay, yes, please, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I just want to take the opportunity before I ask my question to give a great vote of thanks for each of the speakers. This was almost therapeutic to listen to them. So thank you very much. And also thank you to the Islamic Cooperation Youth Forum for the courage to host or co-host this particular space. I do not think that can be taken lightly. And I know that people like Craig and others understand how difficult and challenging it is to speak truth in New York City, amongst other places in the United States. So thank you for that wisdom and courage. What I'm curious about is, I think, one of the strengths that all of the speakers, distinguished speakers, spoke to and referenced in many ways, which is that this is a people's tribunal. And I think that this is indeed a very fascinating, important, strategic wisdom and space, but I'm kind of missing the people's voices and the people's presence in this particular session, at least, because I think what we can mobilize, what you are already very actively working to enable, is precisely that global civil society-wide space. But where is civil society in this room today, at least? And I have a feeling that there could be probably just a little bit more done to bring some of those very weighty presence of global civil society, including, but by no means limited to, some of the religious and interfaith spaces, but also some of the secular spaces. Amnesty International is in the building, could have been easily invited, but I'm just a little bit curious as to why such a powerful space of truth and call for justice is not complemented by a powerful presence of civil society. Thank you.
So again, to summarize, on the one hand, gratitude for the presentations that were therapeutic in naming the truth of what we're all witnessing. And on the other hand, query that for a tribunal that is committed to being a global civil society-wide space, why so limited a turnout from global civil society in this room more generally? So I myself am not certain of what participation looks like virtually at the moment, and there may be good reasons why, global civil society has difficulty accessing the United States, accessing New York, exclusions across the board. But I know that we are present both live, and I presume a recording will also be made available. But beyond virtual participation, the question is, how is the tribunal more generally seeking to engage global civil society, if not today, then just more generally? And again, the floor is open to our steering committee members here in New York with us. And, yeah, I know, here in New York with us, as well as those who are on the screen. Richard, this seems like a question you might be well situated to begin to answer, at least.
I'm not sure I clearly understood the question. The audio wasn't sufficient.
The audience, when, for example, Amnesty International is also present in this building, why were they not invited? Were they not invited? And so on. But I think it's also a platform to answer a broader question, which is, how is global civil society being engaged more generally in the work of the tribunal? And particularly, how might they be involved in the upcoming tribunal session that you've described in Istanbul in October?
Doing our best to have a global outreach that emphasizes the potential of global civil society. And in the structure of the tribunal, the People's Tribunal, we have a civil society council that's trying to draw the activism of NGOs around the world that are more or less aligned with our goals to participate directly and indirectly in the work of the tribunal. We're making concerted efforts to reach independent media and to encourage their presence in Istanbul to report on the tribunal's proceedings. And we are several of the people on this panel have published fairly widely around the world, trying to activate interest and solidarity with the goals of the tribunal. Whether this is, it's certainly not sufficient, but it represents within our capacities a dedication to mobilizing global civil society to the extent that it's possible at this urgent moment where the tragedies of the Palestinian people have reached such a gruesome climax. And that's partly why I think when seeing finally, much too late, the bodies of more independent governments and parts of the UN even trying to escape from the suppression of the genocidal character of Israel's behavior to finally say what the eyes and ears of the world are disclosing. It's significant, for instance, that Netanyahu now speaks, as he did a day or two ago, about Israel having to look to a future where it must become, in his words, a super Sparta. In other words, a highly militarized state dependent completely on itself and acknowledging its isolation from the rest of the world. That's a quite unexpected acknowledgement of the success of the kind of mobilization in global society that has been taking place. And he also said that we not only have to be a Sparta, but we have to learn that we are economically and politically isolated. And this goes back to what Wadir was expressing in terms of the fact that there is this extraordinary surge of conscience that is challenging the geopolitical domination of the media and of the way in which public discourse on the Palestinian issue is formulated, so that there is something changing. Whether it's too late to make a difference to the people of Gaza is the question that haunts, I think, those of us that are trying to act and intervene in some way that will stop the carnage. And one point I want to make that hasn't been, I think, clearly articulated is that most of the discussions of the day after presuppose a kind of Israeli control over the parameters of what a stabilized future would entail, including the exclusion of Hamas as, because of its so-called terrorism, without recognizing it as the center of Palestinian resistance and resilience. And at the very least, Palestinian self-determination calls for an election of who should represent the Palestinian people. It should certainly not be a legacy of the Oslo diplomacy, which established the Palestinian Authority as a quasi-collaborative entity. The Palestinian people deserve the legitimacy of their own representation determined by a freely monitored election. And Israel, as the perpetrator of genocide, should certainly not be given this role of shaping the post-genocidal realities of occupied Palestine. And of course, that relates back to the unenforceable, as of now, advisory opinion of the ICJ, which, as Michael has explained, would mandate the withdrawal of all Israeli presence from the occupied Palestinian territories, but Israel's moving in exactly the opposite directions. But I think it's a very important point that we not lose sight of, that Israel should not be treated as if it has any legitimate role in shaping the future of the Palestinian participation, and that Palestinian self-determination should be given the kind of recognition that it's been long denied.
Craig wants to talk.
Question of global civil society
Yes.
engagement.
Thank you very much for the question regarding civil society participation. And I think it is an important one because we can't take civil society's participation for granted. I've been in the civil society space for decades, and there's a much more critical lens through which civil society engages and where it channels its energy. So I think it is incumbent upon the tribunal itself to make itself relevant to civil society, and that might be a responsibility for the outreach moving forward once the tribunal concludes its observations as part of the process. I think there is going to be more input in the closing of the tribunal to allow greater space for civil society and witness testimonies. But I do think it is the responsibility of the tribunal to make itself relevant to civil society. Civil society will not be coming and be taken for granted.
Yes, Craig, I think you are also going to be our final, you will have the last word.
Thing that Wissam and Richard said. I mean, the Gaza Tribunal is a mechanism of civil society. It's not an official institution that collaborates with civil society. It is of, by, and for civil society in the first instance. Secondly, it is in the structure of the Gaza Tribunal, there are mechanisms that include the participation, especially of Palestinian civil society. So that means Palestinian civil society organizations have a seat at the table, but many of our members are drawn from Palestinian civil society, and many of the rest of us are drawn from global civil society. So it's a mechanism in that regard. So if there aren't hundreds of people in the room for today's event, that can be chalked up to two things. One is we didn't do good promotions, and two is that there's a lot going on for the last 2 days in New York with which we are competing, and so you're not going to be able to draw everybody into the room. But I also wanted to just say quickly in response to Richard's second point, that's something we all need to be paying attention to, is that you read the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, which finally said what all of us had been saying for years, which is, the entire paradigm of expecting the Palestinians to be living a reality outside of international law and to have to negotiate with their oppressor for whatever rights they get, that never made any sense. And finally, the International Court of Justice has said it doesn't make any sense and that those rights exist. What hasn't happened across the street from the Church Center yet is that delegations in New York have not understood that their job is not to negotiate with Israel on whether or not Palestinians will have food and water and freedom and life, but rather to hold the Israeli regime accountable, to cut off economic, diplomatic, and trade relations. Again, we're not inventing this. This is also from the language of the ICJ as well. But to hold the Israeli regime accountable, to isolate the regime, to weaken the regime, ultimately to defeat and dismantle the regime, as was done with the apartheid regime in South Africa. Nothing is ever going to make the kind of progress that we have until we make a righteous noise and demand that this happens. And those people across the street with the lanyards and the ties start respecting international law and the way they engage on this issue. And I will just finish by reiterating that this week, this moment, is an absolutely historic, pivotal moment where those delegations across the street, and we've been speaking to a lot of these delegations. Earlier today, I was talking individually to delegations about this. They will either do what it is that they are there to do in accordance with the norms and standards and charter of the United Nations, or they will miss a very important opportunity and will have declared by their inaction or their irrelevant action that it's all over, that the 80th anniversary of the United Nations is its last, and it's going to wither on the vine and die because they don't have the political courage to do what it is that they're supposed to do according to international law, according to international human rights, and the demands of global civil society, which, by the way, is under attack, and all we have is each other, whether it is the Sumud flotilla, whether it was the march to Gaza, whether it is the student encampments, whether it is the Gaza Tribunal, whether it is the demonstrations in capitals all around the world. That is the light in the middle of a very dark period, and either those folks across the street are going to see that light or they're not. And if they don't, there will only be, I think, sealing the fate of the United Nations and of these institutions that were built up since the Second World War. But, you know, for us, our job is solidarity.
And thank you to the audience that have stayed with us through, I think, 2.5 hours of really riveting presentations and discussions. So thank you so much to everyone. And with this, we'll conclude this side event. Thank you again.
Thank you. Ağzınıza sağlık. Teşekkür ederim.
Tabii rica ederim.
Teşekkür ederim.